Well, greetings, future social workers. My name is Dr. Antonio Mako, and I will be providing your mini lesson today for your MSW fieldwork course. The topic for today's training is going to be the Continuum of Care Reform, a very recent policy that's been implemented throughout the state of California impacting child welfare. What we're going to do is I'm going to provide you with an overview of AB 403. That's also referred to as Continuum of Care Reform. It's also referred to as Assembly Bill 403. And I'm going to do a quick policy analysis of what were some of the intended and unintended consequences of AB 403. What does it mean for you in your future career as a social worker should you choose to work within the field of child welfare? And we're going to examine some biblical lessons from Jesus' life. We're going to look at some of the policies that Jesus established in his time with us on earth. We're also going to examine some of the policies that Jesus challenged, some of the socio-political norms that existed during the time, and why was it that policy became so important based on what Jesus did in his time with us on this earth. And we're going to use a tool, a little guide that I put together for things to consider when you're creating policy in your future career as a social worker. So a little bit about me before we get started. I've worked in the fields of child welfare, mental health, juvenile probation, and education for the past 15 years. I've done direct case management, I've done supervisory leadership, executive leadership, and later in my career I started to build, to analyze, and to shape policy at the local and the state level. So now I still sit on a couple of work groups related to policy. And to be honest with you, out of all the topics I could have brought to you today, the reason in particular I brought this particular policy of AB 403 to the table, one, it is that it's reshaped the field for social workers and for mental health professionals, marriage family therapists in the field of child welfare. So one is I wanted you to be informed of what's happening out in the field. But the second reason is because I'm hoping that through this lecture you might be able to feel a little more connected to what policy is, why policy is important, and specifically how policy impacts individuals. Something so macro, such as a system policy, has a direct impact on the micro of the individual who's receiving those services. And so the idea behind this is to give you some concrete examples of this policy and examine the notion of policy in Jesus' time so that you can see and value the work that can be done in this policy arena. So even if you think that right now policy isn't something for you, maybe through this work you might consider it. So if I don't have you in one of my classes, I'll show a quick picture of myself so you can see what I look like. So that's me. I know what you guys are thinking. Yes, I do model professionally on the side. When I am not doing the professor thing, I am jet setting all over Europe, high fashion model weeks and all that kind of stuff, magazine shoots and such. So that's me. And none of that modeling stuff was true. I just brought that up for fun. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the actual lesson. So for this lesson today, you're going to need three things: a computer or a notebook, just something where you can take down notes as I move through the slides, a blank piece of paper to start off with one quick activity that we're going to do. And if you have a Bible that you would like to have near you in order to refer to some of the scripture verses or reflect on those or read those later, then you're more than welcome to do that. What we're going to cover today is a quick activity to open up the topic. I'm going to give you a brief overview of child abuse with some national as well as local statistics. We're going to talk about policy, particularly what is policy and why does it matter. We're going to dive slightly into AB 403. Like I said, days, weeks can be spent training on this. Years were spent creating it. So I'm giving you the broad strokes of what AB 403 is, what it's intended to do, what were some of the unintended consequences, and then what we're going to do is examine some biblical themes of policy based on Jesus' words and deeds. And then finally, we're going to end with a brief spiritual activity for you all. So that's what we're going to cover today in our time together. So let's start with this activity. If you can go ahead and take out that blank piece of paper that you have. And what I would like for you to do is I'm going to ask you to take 2 minutes. And what you're going to do is when I say go, you'll go ahead and take 2 minutes to take that paper and turn it into a shape that can get it as small as possible. It doesn't matter what you need to do to that paper to get it into a shape that's as small as possible. You can fold it, bend it, ball it up, step on it, tear it, do whatever you need to do, but go ahead and make that paper the tiniest representation of itself as you can. So go ahead and set a timer for 2 minutes. And when I say go, you can go ahead and push pause, and then go ahead and fold that paper up. Get it as small as you can. All right, go. Okay, if you're back from the break, then what I'm going to ask you now to do for the second part of this activity is I need you to unfold that paper and return it exactly to the shape it was before you started changing it. So go back and transform that paper without using any other sheet. Get rid of the wrinkles, the tears, the stomps, the bends, whatever the case is, and get it back to its exact state that it was in prior to beginning this activity. And I'll give you 1 minute to go ahead and do that. You can go ahead and push pause now and go ahead and begin. Okay, so if you're back from that 1 minute break and trying to restore your paper to what it was before, I think you're starting to understand that the point of this activity is that you can't, right? The idea behind it is that paper, once bended, once torn, once squashed, whatever the case is, it's going to be impossible to return it to exactly what it was before. And how I'd like to introduce this topic for today, in our child abuse statistics, there's a Chinese proverb that reads, "A child's life is like a piece of paper on which every person leaves a mark." I heard this proverb very early on in my career, and it started to make a lot of sense to me in different ways as I advanced through my career. One of the things that I realized was, obviously the trauma that children experience in their lives, the events that occur, the things that are taken away or placed upon them, leave a mark emotionally upon their lives. But one of the things that I also started to truly understand and learn is that policy does the same thing. Policies that we create impact individuals in their daily lives. Sometimes we think that policy doesn't matter, but it really does. And policy, a good policy, can serve to uplift human beings and to give opportunities and advocacy. But poor policies can serve to do systemic trauma to individuals as well. And so I wanted to start with this brief activity so that you can kind of understand the importance and the responsibility that comes with creating policy in child welfare or any other sector of social work that you may be doing later in your careers. I'd like to start with some statistics at the national level related to child abuse and child maltreatment. So in the United States, a child abuse report is made about every 10 seconds. Every day, five children die as a result of child abuse. And every year, over 3.6 million child abuse referrals are made. Now, when you factor in that one report may include multiple children who live in the household, then what that means is that there's over 6.6 million children impacted every year by child abuse. These are significant numbers. And so policy begins to matter even more than what we considered before, because when you're dealing with truly an epidemic of child abuse, when we're talking about 10 seconds, child abuse report being made, 5 children dying daily as a result of child abuse, and we're talking about 6.6 million children impacted, you need policy. You need solid policies in place to guide systems and practitioners on what needs to be done, who needs to be doing it, who it needs to be done to, and most importantly, how we go about doing our work. And so policy becomes incredibly important when we talk about combating these numbers. Let's take a quick look at Riverside County now, at the local lens and our demographics here within Riverside County. Riverside County is the 4th largest county in terms of population and square footage in the United States. In California. We have about 25% of our population from 0 to 17 years old. Here is a very interesting fact, is that our median household income in Riverside County is $60,000. Now, I know a lot of you already understand very well the challenge that a household income of $60,000 would pose living in California, especially living within Southern California. So I think that this number, this median household income, speaks largely to the situations that our children and families are in here within our county. And then Riverside County is composed of 28 cities, 23 school districts, 29 law enforcement agencies, and I love this part about working within Riverside County, 12 federally recognized tribes. This is a diverse county, large, diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and every other form of identity that you can imagine can be found here in Riverside County. So it makes doing work within child welfare fun and interesting and never the same. Let's look specifically at some local child maltreatment data related to Riverside County. And so in 2016, all right, there were 58,000 calls, nearly 59,000 calls to the child abuse hotline here in Riverside County. All right, 50% of those calls, all right, were related specifically to abuse and neglect. All right, that's 29,000 calls were made out of concern that children were being abused and neglected. All right, now, children with maltreatment allegations that also fell outside of simple abuse and neglect, all right, totaled nearly 39,000. That gives us a rate, all right, a population rate of 65 per 1,000 children were facing these allegations, okay? Now, what's important to realize is that social services, out of all these phone calls of 58,000, social services, your frontline social workers with Child Services Division conducted 33,600 investigations in 1 year alone. That's massive, all right? And of those investigations, a little over 5,000, gives us a population rate of 8.8 per 1,000, were found to be true, or what we call in child services, we call them to be substantiated. All right, and what that equated to was, out of all of these allegations found to be true, 1,800 kiddos were removed from their homes and resulted in entry into the child welfare system. That means they were placed away from their parents and placed into, let's say, a resource family, what we were formerly referred to as foster family. I'm going to talk about that name change later. They were placed into residential treatments, non-related extended family members, things like that. That number may not seem high if you don't work in the field of child welfare. But the concern for me lies in a couple of areas. These are 1,800 children that were impacted by child abuse to the point where they were removed from the home. I'm also willing to bet that this 1,800, for these child abuse allegations that were made, this wasn't the first allegation that was encountered for many of these kiddos. Also, the piece that strikes me is that we have nearly 59,000 calls for help to the child abuse hotline, all right, in 2016. These are 59,000 calls for help with folks in the community saying things are not okay for this particular child or family. To me, that number is disturbingly high, and this is all the more reason why policy matters. If we are to combat this issue, right, and address the calls of 59,000 people needing help, we need firm policies in place, policies that are invested in the betterment of children and families, coming at the forefront of our minds to address those numbers, okay? Some very quick demographics on where these calls come from. The majority are coming from the community, as we see here, outside of these areas, right, that we've defined here. A lot of times people think that the schools in particular generate the highest number of child abuse reports, and they would be right almost. In Riverside County, the schools generate the second highest number of child abuse reports for the county. Now, in terms of removal, the primary reason why children are removed from their homes, exists within Riverside County, but this is also general to child welfare as a whole, is due to neglect. All right, 94% of the calls in Riverside County related to child abuse were related to neglect, and they were removed for those reasons. Now, even though physical and sexual abuse do tend to take headlines and get the most coverage in the news, the primary reason why children are being removed from their home is because of a failure, an inability, right, a difficulty for parents to be able to provide for the very simple, basic needs that their children need in order to sustain themselves in life. Okay, and that's the primary issue facing our kiddos here in Riverside County. Placement data, and I apologize for the colors being mixed up in this slide, but what I want to emphasize is the majority of kiddos, when they are removed from homes, go to this area, which is actually foster family homes. Okay, foster family homes right here. Now, the language for foster families has changed with the implementation of Continuum of Care Reform, otherwise known as AB 403. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in future slides, but that's where the majority of kiddos go. Such as many things in life, life can be broken up by doing what we call the mix of the head and the heart. The head refers to the logical pieces of what we do, the time we spend planning around budgets and policy and legislation. And the heart often refers to the motivation between why we do the things the way we do them. Some of you were motivated to join the MSW program and to become social workers out of an essence of social responsibility. Some of you were personally called to pursue an MSW for family reasons or for personal reasons. Some of you felt motivated for spiritual reasons. Whatever the case was, that refers to your heart and what motivates you to do this. The one piece why I want to highlight this is because when dealing with policy and shaping policy, it's important to have a balance of both the head and the heart. You can't spend too much time on one or the other because your policy will be imbalanced. So when we're creating policy, when we're critiquing policy, when we're reforming policy, we need to have conversations surrounding the head, right? The idea behind what are we doing fiscally, legislatively, related to this particular issue. But we can't forget why we stepped into this field and are advocating for that particular group that's impacted by that policy to begin with. Here's a funny example coming from the Native American Dakota tribe about what happens when we spend too much time in the head arena developing policy, okay? So Dakota tribal wisdom says that when you discover you're riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. However, in larger governmental or modern systems, we have developed far more advanced strategies, right, for dealing with a dead horse. Strategies which include the following. We will buy a stronger whip. We'll suggest to change riders. We'll threaten to terminate the dead horse. We'll say things like, this is the way we've always ridden a dead horse. We'll appoint a committee to study the dead horse. We'll arrange to visit other sites to see how they ride dead horses. We'll create training sessions to increase our riding ability. Excuse me. We'll harness together several dead horses for increased speed. We'll declare that no horse is too dead to be beaten. We'll provide additional funding to increase horses' performance. We'll declare a horse is better, faster, and cheaper dead. We'll study alternative uses for dead horses. We will rewrite the expected performance expectations for all dead horses. And finally, my favorite, we'll just go ahead and promote that dead horse to a supervisor position, right? And so this is funny, but the idea behind this is this is an example of what happens when we spend too much time in the head arena of building policy. What we do is if we're absent of the heart when building policy, we tend to develop strategies such as these. That really what we're saying is lack originality. They lack creativity. They're not outside the box. They're not collaborative. And they do little to serve the individuals who we're trying to address. Okay? And so the idea behind this is that if we're going to create policy, there has to be a balance between the head and the heart. Einstein had once said we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. This speaks again to that notion that if we're going to solve a problem and we're going to do it using policy, we have to be creative. We have to think outside the box. We can't settle to perpetuate systems of power. In some cases, we have to have the courage to step up and speak up against some of the powers that be in order to create policies for the interest of those who truly need them, okay? And so the idea behind this is, as Einstein had told us, if we're going to use the same thinking, the same old ideas to fix problems that we use to create them, we're not going to get very far in creating change, okay? So let's talk really briefly about what policy is and why it matters. Policy, according to the Collins Dictionary, is a set of ideas or plans that is used as a basis for making decisions, especially in politics, economics, or business, all right? what I went ahead and did was kind of break that down on a more practical level. And so what policy does is policy shapes attitudes, actions of governments, systems, and individuals. Policy says what is to be done, who does it, for whom it's being done to, and how. So do you see what I'm saying about why policy, starting as something so macro, begins to move its way down to the micro? Policy impacts individuals in intended and unintended forms. I have not seen in my time working in child welfare one policy that didn't have a combination of intended and unintended consequences. It doesn't always mean that unintended consequences are bad. They're not all bad, but it's important to consider that when you're building a policy, there's always something that's going to happen, a byproduct of that policy that you did not intend. It's important to not ignore those unintended consequences. Finally, policy then is what it's all about. What it all boils down to is policy, therefore, stands for what a government or a system or an individual is for. What do they stand for? What are they all about? When we get to the biblical side of examining policy, what policies did Jesus challenge? And what policies did Jesus stand for? This is where you see that Jesus' policies often focused on the individual. Not only the individual, but the individuals in society who needed it the most, who were the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most discriminated against systemically. All right, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. First, before talking about continuum of care, we have to talk about a landmark case that existed within the field of child welfare, very recent within our lifetime, which is known as the KDA lawsuit. All right, so I'm just going to paint a really quick picture of what the KDA lawsuit is, because when you step out in the field of social work, some of the codes that you're going to bill for under Medi-Cal, some of the meetings that you're going to have with families, some of the interactions you're going to have with kids, the notes that you're going to write documenting that are all going to be as a result of this landmark case of KDA. And so you're going to want to know why you're doing that. So back in July 18, 2002, a class action lawsuit was filed against CDSS, that's the California Department of Social Services, and LA DCFS, which is Los Angeles County's Department of Children and Family Services. All right, the case was later settled in 2011. KDA is the name of a girl who had spent, she was 14 years old and had spent 10 years in foster care. She later died in placement. Now, in that time that she was in foster care, KDA was in 37 different placements, including 19 psychiatric placements. This 14-year-old girl had been through all of this. An investigation was launched following her death, and concerns were found to be systemic, and gaps between the Child Services Division and the Department of Mental Health were identified. Another disturbing fact relating to this case is when the investigation was initiated, this investigation into both of these systems of mental health and child welfare, one of the things they also discovered was KDA was one of many children who had died in care as a result of gaps in services. And so the case in 2011 was settled. And as a result of that, California child welfare system, as well as LA County and Department of Mental Health in particular, said we have to do things different. Legally, we are bound to now do business different than we did before. From that change was born the Integrated Core Practice Model, or what we refer to as ICPM, okay? And so I'm going to go into a little bit of that later. ICPM, Integrated Core Practice Model, and AB 403 are both aligned to do basically similar functions. What they're aligned to do is kiddos who are entered into child welfare system often find themselves interacting usually with these three key players: mental health, child protective services, and juvenile probation. And what happens is that these services, for the majority of kids, if they're only involved in one of these, or two, but maybe not three, what's going to happen is that they can meet those services, pass through this system without interacting with the others, and life goes on as normal. However, 1% of these kiddos come into these systems exhibiting some of the most complex, severe abuse and neglect that's happens within our society. And the problem is that you have kids who are interacting with all of these systems. And the problem was that in the past, the line between these systems were broken. They didn't exist. Communication between mental health, CPS, and juvenile probation was minimal at times. And what happened was those 1% of kids, the kids who needed services the most, often fell through the gaps with devastating consequences similar to that of KDA. And so what happened was is that both of these pieces of legislation or landmark cases were designed to create a paradigm shift within the field of child welfare. So what you had in the past is that a child or family experiencing child welfare, all right, and going and needing help from multiple systems needed to go to different places to do that. So here on the left, this is an example of the old form of child welfare and services that existed. If a child needed mental health services, family needed to go to a clinic. If they needed a food bank, if they needed housing, if they needed other community support, they needed to go to those community places. If they needed help at school, then they needed to go to the education system. And if they had court hearings and family court or juvenile probation, guess what? They're going to those places too. That sounds nice. The problem is that for children and families who had low income, no car, were dependent upon a bus for transportation, who were battling substance dependency, whose kiddos were running away from home, who were in the process of reunification, had a difficult time making this happen, rightfully so, right? And so what happened was that what ICPM and AB 403 called for was an overlap in services. Here, the child and family is the center of the treatment plan. And outside, in these circles here, and I apologize they're not shown in this slide, but what would happen is you would have plans overlap with the children and families. So here you may have CPS. Here you may have mental health. Here you may have education. And what happens is under this model is all the services are designed to overlap with the children and family at the center of this system, all right? And that is what this system is called to do. Now, where we are today, on January 1st, 2017, AB Assembly Bill 403 went into implementation. It's known as the Continuum of Care Reform piece. And so now what you've got in the field of child welfare is CCR and ICPM existing at the same time, all geared towards aligning services towards children and families, all right? So this serves as a philosophy of practice for both mental health professionals and social workers. Particularly, two systems are impacted largely by these shifts in policy. All right, one is the Department of Healthcare Services, otherwise referred to as DHCS, or Mental Health for the state, all right, and the California Department of Social Services, all right, for the state. And this impacts every county that's providing services within the state of California. Here are some very quick changes as a result of AB 403. And as a result of this, I want to let you know these, but you should also know there's a lot more to this. So if you ever have any more questions about this, you can come talk to me because it goes way deeper than what I'm just giving you in an hour, okay? A couple of things, though. There are no more group homes in the state of California. We used to refer to homes, residential settings, when children were removed from the home as group homes. Now we refer to them as short-term residential treatment placements. This isn't just a name change. Fundamentally, the core of residential has changed, or should change at least according to legislation. But we can talk about that another day. We also no longer use the term foster families or foster family agencies within the state of California. We refer to former foster families and resource families as, resource families or resource family agencies, okay? So the idea behind this is that in the past, if you were a foster family or applying for kinship or non-related extended family members or other individuals who were taking kiddos into your home because they had nowhere else to go, there was a different process for most, if not all of those, to become one of those families. So the state of California said, okay, we're gonna create one system for certification, and they're all gonna be resource family agencies or resource families that they're working with. Finally, the level of care system that existed for residentials for group homes in the past was eliminated. We used to have a level 2 through level 14 level system in the state of California. That's gone now. And as a result of this, and I'm sorry this picture got in the way here, but basically MFTs and MSWs, when you step into the field of child welfare, you're going to be asked to do things that you didn't necessarily do before. And so let's talk really quickly about those. Some required skill sets, and basically in a nutshell, I'll let you read these later in the interest of time. One of the things that I wanted to highlight, though, is that there's going to be more positions opening up for licensed. This LMHP is a licensed mental health professional. The idea behind this is some of the residential treatment programs are going to require certain positions to be licensed. So if you are interested in licensure, that's good because there'll be positions created for you there. However, let's say you're not going to be licensed. You want to pursue your MSW and pursue, some community work and things like that. That is absolutely okay. There's going to be increased opportunities for administrator positions that don't require licensure, executive director positions, program director positions, regional program directors and such, for both MSWs and LCSWs. So that's one thing to consider. How you go about doing your work as a result of AB 403, though, will be important to understand. Again, I'm going to let you read through these slides later, but I want to identify a key few important areas of this. For those of you doing clinical work, you're going to want to base your work soundly in a strong theoretical framework. Evidence-based, otherwise referred to as EBP, evidence-based practices, is going to be important, okay? And so evidence-based practices, these are just a couple, but TFCBT is one of those, so that's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Motivational interviewing, the CAFAS, which is the Child Adolescent Functioning Assessment Scale, is used. The CANS, which is the Child Adolescent Needs and Strengths Survey. There's also some others, DBT. I think we said motivational interviewing already. Seeking safety is another one. You're going to want to become sound in that. You want to continue to stay updated in your training. Develop yourself as a professional. Don't be stagnant in your training. Don't just stop learning. That's important to understand. The other piece to this is that you're going to want to develop your case management and non-clinical case planning skills. And I say that because with AB 403, if you're doing clinical work, you're going to also now be required to do basic case management strategies surrounding court hearings and dates and reporting to probation officers and things like that. That's part of your skill set that you're going to need to do now. Also, if you're not doing clinical work, you're still going to be required to be clinically informed at least. So you don't need to be an expert in TFCBT, for example, but you do need to have a comprehension or an understanding of what it means to be trauma informed in the service delivery that you're providing. Okay, so just some quick examples. Now, I do want to touch on this very briefly because I want you to understand that when I had said earlier that there were unintended consequences to every policy that's implemented, here are a few of the unintended consequences that we are experiencing in the field of child welfare regarding AB 403, okay? One thing was, when it was initially implemented, we did see some experience in fidelity drift, or what we call role ambiguity or confusion amongst professionals. So when I was saying that there were certain things that MSWs either did before or didn't do that now they are doing, or MFTs didn't do certain things before and now they are required to do these things, this created a little bit of confusion for those individuals. What we did experience was, and this was a severe unintended consequence, was the closure of small private residential agencies, and even for those larger agencies that were private and they had multiple programs or maybe existed in multiple states, we saw where some of those agencies actually closed their residential programs within their agencies and kept the other programs open. This was huge because what we saw was that children were displaced as a result of that. When these group homes, formerly group homes, closed down because they couldn't convert to STRTP, then children found themselves without places to go. And so what happened is that the reason some of these agencies closed doors because there was additional costs inherited to make their way through accreditation, to hire staff for positions that did not yet have adequate funding. And what we saw was an additional administrative and financial strain on some of these agencies who are private nonprofits just trying to make by. And so what happened is that there was a displacement of children combined with a shortage of resource families, particularly for teenage foster youth and probation youth, all right, and where children were displaced. Another piece to consider and that we discuss a lot within the field of child welfare is this emphasis on short term. Many of us don't disagree with the proposed system of CCR. We agree that children don't need to be in institutional settings for long periods of time. We don't want kids to become institutionalized. So we want kids to be in the community with people that know and love them. However, the challenging part with that is that these STRTPs were designed to deal with some of the kiddos with the most complex needs. So these are acute, what we call high risk, okay, behaviors exhibited by some of these kiddos. And so what happened is then you combine that with short term and it becomes a little challenging, for example. So take a kiddo that, say, has experienced high abuse and neglect in their lifetime, their short lifetime. And now they're battling a co-occurring disorder of mental health issues combined with substance dependency. And now what we're saying is that ideally, if we can, we need that kiddo to spend no more than 6 months in a residential setting. For those of you who engage in clinical work later, you'll start to understand the difficulty, the challenge to providing adequate mental health care and treatment to kiddos with acute needs and complex needs in a short period of 6 months. So these are just some of the unintended consequences. Now, I'm not going to go as far and say that AB 403 isn't good. It's not good for kids and families. I won't say that because this is a significant shift. No policy is going to be perfect when it's rolled out. However, I do believe that policymakers have a responsibility to go back and understand why these occurred. Where were there missed readings or understandings of what we were doing? Where have things been broken and where do they need to be fixed? Remember, that's the balance between the head and the heart. At the end of the day, I know this can all sound very discouraging. You know, some of you may be asking, did AB 403 even fix anything or did it just make it worse? I don't know the answer to that just yet. I think that there are things that certainly aren't in good shape right now that need to be addressed. I don't know if that's solely policy's fault. I think that there's a lot of things to consider, a lot of factors moving in that. But one thing that I do take comfort in is this particular scripture verse from Romans, that we know that all things work for good in those for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And so I think what that helps me take comfort in is saying, okay, I can't be involved in every policy discussion. I may not know what policy is going to come out next, but I do know that what I can do in working for good is working for God's purpose. And that the individual time that I spent in a system influencing lives of those that I serve can lead to macro changes. I still believe at this point it's possible for individuals to change systems. And I do believe, and I had learned this early on in my career, that you can be firm in policy, but flexible in procedure. What I mean by that is you can be firm in your policy in upholding what your organization is about. But the procedures that you use to get there, you can be flexible in. All right? And last but not least, I would say we can't be passive in shaping the future of the fields of mental health and social work. We've stepped into these fields because we want to be advocates for the voiceless, right? We want to be world changers. So the idea behind this is if there's something that you see in a policy that you don't like, if you see it impacting you or your clients in a negative way, you have to be willing to speak up. So I put this little piece here, says your work matters because ultimately you matter. What you do matters. You can't be drowned by the overwhelming, sometimes frustrating elements of policy. You have to understand that policy was created by people so we can change it too, okay? So let's shift up gears because I only have a few minutes left into this biblical notion of policy. And let's talk about why Jesus was seen as such a radical individual in the time where he was with us. Jesus challenged policy significantly in the time that he was with us, and this wasn't well received by certain individuals within society. So Jesus in his time was considered radical. He was actually referred to as a rabble-rouser, okay, a problem maker, all right? Jesus, when he went about doing his work with his disciples, broke socio-political norms. He challenged the status quo, all right? I'm going to give examples of that in the next couple of slides. So as a result of that, when you challenge the status quo, the problem is that those that are in power, particularly in Jesus' time, Romans and the Pharisees, were threatened and angered by Jesus' words and actions. This alone was a reason why he was punished severely and brutally killed as a result of his policies, as were his disciples. Even after Jesus was crucified, the disciples were hunted down and they were murdered. In some cases, those murders weren't successful, so they were banished. And this was a result of what Jesus stood for. And so I thought it'd be interesting to see, well, what social norms did Jesus challenge? I mean, back then, according to the Pharisees, under the laws of Judaism, in the 1st century BCE, what could you not do that Jesus was doing that was so radical, right? And so in Jesus' time, you didn't touch lepers. You don't eat with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, or other individuals viewed as unclean. You don't speak to women, especially hold them in elevated status. You don't speak or interact with Gentiles, which are non-Jews. And as a result of this, as Jesus went about doing his works in the name of his Father, he defied social norms, but he also broke Jewish laws. This is something to consider here. More importantly then, so he has one group, the Pharisees, that are upset by what he's doing, but also there was another group that was threatened by his talk. And that was particularly the power structure and stability of communities and provinces under the rule of the Roman Empire. So back then, when Rome was an empire, it was led by satellite leadership. And so what happened was that if you had an uprising as a Roman leader in your province, you could be thrown in jail by those above you, your administrators above you, and even sometimes executed if you couldn't squash that rebellion. What Jesus was doing was inciting differences and power differentials that were existing within society. This, for a lack of a better word, scared those in power. And as a result, this is why he was silenced. So, what were Jesus' policies? There were a lot, to be honest with you. I'm only giving you 4 today because we only have an hour. Okay, so here's a few policies that I highlighted that are spoken of in Scripture that I really love because they align with social work related to Jesus and his policies. 1, Jesus stood for the dignity of the individual. Jesus believed that and spoke to all individuals hold intrinsic, God-given value and therefore deserve to be treated with dignity. I love this scripture verse by Matthew chapter 10. Are not 2 birds sold for a small coin, yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's knowledge. Even all the hairs on your head have been counted. So do not be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. That's an amazing scripture verse, I believe, that speaks to that every human being is entitled to dignity. Whether you're Jewish or not, whether you're poor or rich, whether you're in power or not, you all carry dignity. Second was the distribution of wealth and power. In Matthew chapter 21, you can find the reference to when Jesus entered the temple and overturned the tables and the goods that were being sold in the temple. And this is because the temple had become a place of extortion in which the individuals were being overcharged for the items being sold, and the Pharisees were excluding undesirable groups from worshiping within the temple. And this upset Jesus. He literally was proposing to overthrow or overturn this practice. This is why this was so powerful. In the issue of nonviolence, and many of you have seen this quote from Matthew as well, you have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your cheek, turn the other one to him as well. If anyone wants you to go to law with you over your tunic, hand them your cloak. Should anyone press you in service for 1 mile, go with him for 2 miles. Give to one who asks of you, and do not turn your back on the ones who want to borrow. This is an important piece because in that time, gestures of warfare and power differentials were important. Jesus says that doesn't matter. Nonviolence is how you achieve social change. Last, Jesus' first act with the apostles was via civil disobedience. He broke a law of the Sabbath in his first public act with his disciples. You can find that here in Mark. And went on to break several more social acts as a result of that. And so these are just brief examples, some of the policies that Jesus stood up for. I believe, this is just me personally, that one of the best examples, though, of Jesus, and when you ask what policies did Jesus support, can be found here in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. Thus they persecuted the prophets who were there before you. I love the language that was used in here, right? So what Jesus' policies are about, who they're going to serve? The poor, those who are hurt and who are mourning. The meek, right? Those who hunger for thirst and righteousness. And then Jesus says how you go about doing that work and serving those groups is through mercy, is through having a clean heart, through peace, right? And what's more so, that if you find that you are persecuted, insulted, right, as a result of standing for these values, you will be rewarded in heaven for this. He took authority away from those who were in power from kings, from Pharisees, from state leaders, and said, ultimately, this is how you're led to serve. Your reward needn't be here on this earth. It will be there for you in heaven. This was a scary notion back then to perform or to propose, and even now it is. So I wanted to remind you again, and now we've examined some of these policies that Jesus challenged, and as well as what Jesus set forth for us. Look at what Jesus stood for, right? What Jesus was all about. And you can see why policy matters. What we say, what we do, what we stand for, the process of explaining what is to be done, who does it, for whom it's being done, to and how, it all matters, okay? So I put together a quick tool for you before the end of our final minutes together of what the Bible can teach us about creating policy. If we ask a few of these quick questions, whether it be in a secular or Christian context, I think it could provide a lot of clarity to us when building policy. So what if we were to ask the question, is this policy intended to improve our situation or the population in question? Does the policy meet the needs of man or the needs of God's children? What social norms does this policy uphold? And likewise, what social norms does this policy challenge? If this policy is this policy implemented in a manner that upholds the teachings of Christ, or are they out of step with our Christian roots? And what are the byproducts of our unanticipated consequences of this policy? More specifically, would these align with the teachings of Jesus? So what if we were to take these questions and make them specific to AB 403, right? Like, what if we ask these questions of AB 403? Would that help shape our opinion of how we feel about, one, the effectiveness of this policy, and two, how do we begin to correct some of it, right? So let's do that. So let's apply this guide to AB 403. Does AB 403 improve our, meaning the professional situation, or does it improve the lives of the foster youth who it's intended to serve? Does AB 403 meet the needs of systems of care or the needs of God's children? What social norms does AB 403 uphold? In other words, what positive and negative perceptions of foster youth, dignity and rights of children and families, and concepts of justice does AB 403 uphold? Is this a just policy? Is basically what I'm saying. What social norms does this policy challenge? In other words, what changes, right, for the systems and the professionals for the betterment of children as a result of AB 403? We can't say that our lives are only going to be easier as a result of this policy and not the clients we're serving. Is AB 403 implemented in a manner that upholds the teaching of Christ, or is its implementation out of step with our Christian roots? And finally, we know what the byproducts or some of the unanticipated consequences are at this point in AB 403's implementation. Would these consequences align with the teaching of Christ, right? In other words, did we perpetuate a broken system serving children, or did we truly improve the lives of children in foster care? I'm not expecting an answer to that. I can't honestly say that I have a concrete answer for you at this point in time. What I can tell you, though, is it helps me, this guide, put things into perspective as to where to go next. It also acknowledges where we've done wrong, a disservice to children and families that we're serving as a result of some of these unintended consequences. And so if you ever feel like you're in a spot where you need to develop policy, but you're not sure where to go, you can always apply this guide here to your policy and see, is it something that's in tune with what Christ would do and what a social worker is called to do under our code of ethics. All right. Finally, I want to spend a couple of moments for those of you who have class with me. We're going to do this for the last 5 minutes of class. For those of you who have class with me, I end every class with a centering exercise, and I love to do this no matter if we're together or we're separate. And the idea behind this is that if you haven't heard of centering, that's absolutely okay. If you've heard of meditating, then you've essentially heard of centering. Centering is the Christian sort of version of meditating. The practice of centering was first noted and developed by this gentleman called Brother Lawrence. In the 15th century, Brother Lawrence served as a Carmelite monastery monk as a layman in Paris. Now, Brother Lawrence got this idea of centering when he was taking an early morning walk in this transition from late winter into early spring. And on that walk, the ground was still sort of frozen, the air was cold, the sun was just peeking through. And in his book, it's described that Brother Lawrence saw a lone flower bud growing on a vine in this hostile environment. And Brother Lawrence took a moment to examine that flower and felt that God was speaking to him and saying that I'm here and I exist in this moment. I'm always with you. I'm with everything, despite what's happening in terms of the change of seasons and in life. That only this small miracle of a bud blossoming in such a hostile environment could be with the presence of God in that moment. And so what I do in this centering exercise is I take an opportunity, since we're all together, to take this advice from Jesus, that where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am with them. And what we do is we focus on one scripture verse in one word of focus. That one scripture verse in one word will provide a focus for you to think about, where is God present with you in this very moment? And through that scripture verse and that word, what is God's relationship and his message sending to you right now? It's 2 minutes of being calm and silent, being with God in the very moment and being present in this exact moment, okay? So that's what I'd like to do for us right now with this remaining time together. So for the remaining time, what I'd like to do is focus on this scripture verse for today. I give you a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you, so you should love one another. And this comes to us from John chapter 13. Our focus word today will be love. So what I'd like for you to do is go ahead and take a moment to make sure your hands and feet are in a nice comfortable position, flat on the ground, or your hands in your lap if that's how, or on your knees if that's how you're comfortable. Take a moment to close your eyes. Be aware of your breathing. Take short, deep breaths. Push all of the fears, all of the anxieties, all the worries out of your mind. Forget about what happened before this moment today. Forget about what's coming next. And just focus on the fact that God is present with you right now in this very moment. Think about what that scripture verse of this new commandment of loving one another as he has loved you means to you in your relationship. Think about what God is saying through this word of love, and just focus on those two things for these brief moments while God is with you. I'm going to go ahead and give you 2 minutes to do that. I'm going to keep watch of the time. You don't need to pause it. All right? And we'll go ahead and start now, and I'll come back in 2 minutes. Okay, folks, go ahead and open your eyes. Take a nice deep breath. Come back. I hope that activity helped you. I hope that it was something that you enjoyed. This is an activity that you can do not only in class, but if you ever feel stressed or worried about something, if you're going to step into an important meeting, if you need a time or a break in your day before class, taking 2 minutes to do this goes a long way. And as you become stronger at it, you'll learn to actually be able to do it for a lot longer. I want to thank you for taking the time to view the training today. I appreciate you, and I hope to see you soon. So thank you so much.